The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on Securing America's Elections, Part 2, Oversight of Government Agencies. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Last month, this committee held Part 1 of a series of hearings on securing America's elections. In that hearing, 3 witnesses who'd been jointly selected by the committee testified unequivocally that our nation's elections are under attack. Deborah Plunkett, former director on the National Security Council under both President Clinton and President George W. Bush, warned, "We must take bold, decisive, and expeditious steps to address cyber threats. We must treat election security as imperative for safeguarding our democracy." Secretary of State Kathy Boockvar from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania elaborated, "Election security is a race without a finish line, and our adversaries are not slowing down." This testimony has been confirmed by the leaders of our intelligence community. Last month, the Director of National Intelligence testified that foreign actors will view the 2020 U.S. elections as an opportunity to advance their interests. We expect them to refine their capabilities and add new tactics as they learn from each other's experiences and efforts in previous elections. In short, there is no question that our elections, the cornerstone of our free and democratic society, are exposed. Protecting our nation's democratic processes from foreign attack must be among our top priorities, and we are committed to doing the work. Today, we have representatives from the 4 federal agencies leading the charge on election security: the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and the Election Assistance Commission. At their core, elections are run at the state and local level, but our federal government must provide critical support to help states to defend themselves from hostile foreign actors. Protecting our elections requires a whole-of-society approach that relies on coordinated actions by government agencies at all levels, including the agencies represented here today. Federal agencies responsible for protecting our elections have made significant progress since 2016. These efforts are important and commendable, but significant vulnerabilities in our system remain. To start, our efforts must be integrated and coordinated. A simple Google search of report election security issues turns up results for over 20 different groups across agencies and others, these agencies and others. There must be clear lines of authority to ensure that states know which of the multiple programs across these agencies is in charge. Equally important, we must do more to ensure better federal and state collaboration. That requires earning the trust of states. At a public speech on October 3rd, 2018, DHS Director Krebs explained that in 2016, when the federal government called state officials to alert them of threats, there was, as he said, no trust, and there was no certainty or confidence in the ability of the federal government. One way to strengthen trust is through enhanced transparency. In 2016, the specific intent of the Russians was not initially made public. Today, we can do better. We can educate state and local officials and the public about influence operations. By bringing our adversaries' tactics to light, we can prevent them from succeeding. In addition, we must ensure that the development and maintenance of our systems matches the evolving nature of cyber threats. For example, current EAC federal guidelines for our certification processes were created in 2005 and are woefully out of date. As our witness, Mr. Bird of Microsoft, testified last month, this process is more than a decade old, and it's too slow and too burdensome to enable voting officials to respond as quickly as needed to our agile adversaries. Finally, and most importantly, we must ensure that state and local officials, the frontline defenders of democracy, have the resources and support they need to protect our systems. DHS has made it clear that it requires additional resources to fulfill this task. It's requested, for example, 20 additional advisors to help states in anticipation of the 2020 election cycle. On May 15, 2019, the EAC likewise testified before the Senate that the U.S. currently lacks sufficient funding in critical areas to protect our 2020 elections. Unfortunately, however, President Trump and his administration, rather than listening to the warnings of federal agencies about the seriousness of the threat picture and requests for more resources to secure our elections, has done the opposite. The Trump administration has cut senior cyber positions, downsized by half DHS's election security teams, and proposed significant budget cuts to DHS's major election security program. All of these actions leave us more vulnerable to the ongoing threat to our democracy. We will not let this happen. Elections cannot be a partisan issue. They must be an American issue. This committee is committed to working together to protect our democracy from all threats to our elections in all forms, whether to our physical election infrastructure or the ongoing disinformation campaigns coming from adversaries like Russia. I thank each of our witnesses for being here today. My colleagues and I are looking forward to hearing your testimony about your ongoing efforts to secure our elections and what important work remains to be done. Without objection, the ranking member's statement will be placed in the record, and all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witnesses. Matt Masterson is the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, where he manages election security under the National Protection and Programs Directorate. From 2014 to 2018, he served as a U.S. Election Assistance Commissioner. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Masterson served as Interim Chief of Staff for the Ohio Secretary of State, Deputy Chief Information Officer, and Deputy Director of Elections. Mr. Masterson received his BS and BA from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and his JD from the University of Dayton School of Law. Nikki Flores is the Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterintelligence Division of the FBI, where she oversees the intelligence branch, which includes the Foreign Influence Task Force system. Ms. Flores entered the Bureau in 2005 as an intelligence analyst and served in many other positions, including Deputy Assistant Director of Operations Branch 3 in the Counterterrorism Division, where she oversaw terrorism financing operations, strategic operations, and counterterrorism analysis. Ms. Flores has a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Rhode Island and a master's degree in criminology from George Washington University. Adam Hickey is a Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. In that role, he manages the division's efforts to combat national security threats, including threats to our election systems. Before joining the Department of Justice, Mr. Hickey clerked for Judge Jed Rakoff of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York and Judge Robert Katzman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Mr. Hickey received his bachelor's degree from Harvard College and his JD from Yale Law School. Ben Hovland is the Vice Chair of the Election Assistance Commission, where he is the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, which develops the voluntary voting system guidelines. Before being appointed Vice Chair, Commissioner Hovland served as the Acting Chief Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration. Commissioner Hovland received his BA from the University of Central Arkansas and his JD from the University of Oregon. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. We want to thank you all for participating in today's hearing. If you please rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? You may be seated. Okay, let the record show that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. All right. Mr. Masterson, you may begin, and y'all have to push the button to turn your microphone on before you start. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify regarding the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's efforts to help secure our election infrastructure across this country. My name is Matt Masterson. I'm the election lead for CISA and the former chair of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, as well as an election official in the state of Ohio. CISA has a strong relationship with our federal partners seated here at the table and with state and local election officials across the country. Our election-related mission is clear: to support election officials and their private sector partners to identify and manage risks to their systems. Elections are run at the state and local level by dedicated professionals across America's more than 8,800 election jurisdictions, and we work to ensure those officials don't have to defend themselves from sophisticated and persistent threats on their own. Over the last 3 years, we've worked tirelessly to strengthen our partnership with the election community. We already provide free and voluntary resources and services to all 50 states, over 2,100 local and territorial election jurisdictions, 6 election associations, 12 election technology providers, and political organizations, including presidential campaigns. Our approach has been and continues to be threefold. 1, making sure the election community has the information they need to defend their systems. 2, making sure they have the technical support and tools to identify and mitigate risks to their election infrastructure. And 3, building enduring partnerships to advance security efforts together. CISA is laser-focused on building scalable, repeatable mechanisms to dramatically grow our information sharing capabilities. We share contextualized threat intelligence and actionable information through our close partnerships with the intelligence community, law enforcement, and the private sector. More importantly, state and local election officials are sharing what they see on their networks with us. We deployed intrusion detection capabilities, or Albert sensors, to provide real-time detection capabilities of malicious activity on election infrastructure in all 50 states. Second, we provide technical support and services to election officials and vendors. As we refine our understanding of election officials' needs, we are shifting to capabilities that are quicker, less intrusive, and can scale to more jurisdictions. For instance, in 2018 and 2019, we deployed a remote penetration testing capability, thanks in part to the funding provided by Congress. This remote penetration testing capability allows us to identify risks and vulnerabilities to network-connected election systems without having to deploy teams into local election offices and without interrupting both their time and people. CISA has also been working closely with election technology providers to ensure that election systems and other technologies undergo testing to discover and fix vulnerabilities in their software. This scalability is critical because while our initial efforts in 2016 were primarily targeted at state election officials, we recognize the need to increase our support to counties and municipalities who operate elections. For example, the Last Mile initiative provides no-cost information sharing tailored to those jurisdictions to identify cyber risks to their infrastructure and a checklist of action items to mitigate those risks. The final area of focus has been building on enduring partnerships towards our collective defense. It may seem mundane, but governance, communication, coordination, training, and planning are the critical foundation elements of our efforts to secure our nation's elections. For the 2020 election cycle, CISA has built off the lessons learned for the 2018 election and is expanding our work to prioritize the following lines of effort. 1, expanded engagement to local election officials. We continue to work with election officials to improve both their and our understanding of risks to their systems. For instance, in June of this year, we did our second annual Tabletop the Vote exercise, where 47 states, thousands of local election officials, the private sector, and federal government worked together through scenarios to share information and understand how we would all collectively respond to threats to our election infrastructure. With a better understanding of risk, we can identify and provide the resources they need to secure their election systems. CISA has expanded our level of engagement and sharing of best cybersecurity practices with political organizations as well, including the DNC and RNC. CISA has joined FBI and ODNI in offering briefings to the presidential campaigns registered with the FEC and has engaged directly with campaigns to offer our services. CISA, in coordination with our interagency partners, is committed to helping Americans recognize and avoid foreign disinformation operations impacting our elections through innovative efforts like our War on Pineapple campaign, where we educated Americans on the tactics of foreign influence campaign using a topic everyone can relate to, the divisive issue of pineapple on pizza. We'll continue to put out educational material to build resilience in the American public on foreign influence operations. Finally, we're working closely with our intelligence community and the private sector to increase the quantity, quality, and timeliness of intelligence analysis and production at the unclassified levels to help election officials and the public identify and expose foreign influence operations. We at CISA are committed to working with Congress to ensure our efforts cultivate a safer, more secure, and resilient homeland. Once again, thank you for this opportunity to appear before the committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Flores?
Thank you, and good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the FBI's efforts to secure America's elections. As you've just heard, I'm Nikki Flores, Deputy Assistant Director for the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. The FBI is the federal lead for identifying and combating malign foreign influence operations, which target U.S. democratic institutions and values. This also includes the investigation of election-related cyber intrusions and crimes. In order to achieve their strategic geopolitical objectives, foreign adversaries use malign influence operations to shift U.S. policy, distort U.S. political sentiment and discourse, undermine confidence in U.S. democratic institutions and values, or interfere with U.S. electoral processes. Most widely reported these days have been the attempts by foreign adversaries to discredit U.S. individuals and institutions through the use of false personas and fabricated stories on social media platforms. These operations have aimed to spread disinformation, sow civil discord, and ultimately undermine the confidence in our democratic institutions and values. Foreign influence operations involve a wide spectrum of activities. However, it is the subversive, undeclared, criminal, and coercive aspects of these activities that forms the basis of FBI investigative interests. It is why we talk about malign foreign influence. This is by no means a new problem. However, global interconnectedness and online anonymity have changed the character of the overall foreign influence threat and how the FBI and its partners must address it. In my role at the FBI, I oversee the Foreign Influence Task Force, or what we call the FITF. In the fall of 2017, Director Wray established the FITF to combat foreign influence operations targeting the United States. The FITF is led by the Counterintelligence Division and comprised of agents, analysts, and professional staff from the Counterintelligence, Counterterrorism, Cyber, and Criminal Investigative Divisions. Following the 2018 midterm elections, the FBI expanded the scope of the FITF. Previously, our efforts were focused solely on the threat posed by Russia. However, we now have units working to confront malign foreign influence operations, not just from Russia, but also from China, Iran, and other global adversaries. We have refined and focused our strategy. Through the FITF, the FBI takes a three-pronged approach to address this serious threat. The first prong focuses on our investigations and operations. The FITF works with the FBI's 56 field offices to open investigations with a foreign influence nexus. You might think of the FITF as a hub, with FBI field offices and its personnel as the spokes. Our investigative approach seeks to impose costs on our adversaries, specifically key influencers and enablers. Investigations with the Cyber Nexus are worked collaboratively with the FBI Cyber Division and Cyber Task Forces. This way, the FBI can quickly respond to threats to election infrastructure. Moreover, FBI Cyber Division works closely with the U.S. intelligence community to work to determine attribution. The second prong centers on information and intelligence sharing. The FBI worked closely with our fellow intelligence community agencies, as well as with state and local law enforcement partners and election officials to share intelligence to help detect, disrupt, and deter our adversaries. In 2018, that effort led to the creation of Protected Voices, a joint initiative between the FBI, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, United States Secret Service, and the ODNI. Through Protected Voices, we developed a series of videos to help political campaigns better understand this threat and made them available through the FBI's public website. In the past months, we've expanded Protected Voices, providing webinars and in-person briefings to the presidential campaigns on cyber and malign foreign influence threats. Currently, we are expanding the audience to include congressional campaigns and the general public. We collaborate extensively with our U.S. government partners to provide information to state and local governments, election officials, private election vendors, and social media companies so that they can harden their systems against cyber attacks. Collaboration builds a common understanding of the threat landscape. The last prong of our approach is private sector partnerships. Technology companies have a frontline responsibility to secure their own networks, products, and platforms. But we're doing our part by providing actionable intelligence to better enable them to address abuse of their platform by foreign actors. The FBI has established relationships with these technology and social media companies and maintains an ongoing dialogue to enable a rapid exchange of threat information. Across all of these prongs, the FBI is constantly reviewing the effectiveness of its coordination and its outreach. To our knowledge, no foreign government has attempted to tamper with U.S. vote counts. However, even doubts about whether it has occurred can be damaging. But we do know our adversaries are actively trying to influence electoral processes and outcomes in advance of the 2020 election. While our focus today is on election security, I want to note these adversaries seek to influence our national policies and public opinions in important ways beyond just elections. We look forward to continuing this important work and appreciate the support of this committee. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hickey?
Good morning, distinguished members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Justice Department concerning our efforts to ensure the safety and security of our nation's election infrastructure and to combat malign foreign influence. By malign foreign influence, I'm referring to covert actions by foreign governments intended to affect U.S. political sentiment and public discourse, sow divisions in our society, or undermine confidence in our democratic institutions. And these can range from computer hacking that targets election infrastructure or political parties to state-sponsored media campaigns. This issue, protecting our nation's democratic processes, has been and remains a top priority of the department. Our principal role here is the investigation and prosecution of federal crimes. But malign foreign influence efforts extend beyond efforts to interfere with elections, and they require more than law enforcement responses alone. Recognizing that, we approach this national security threat the same as any other, by using our own legal tools as well as supporting the tools and authorities of others. And to the best of our ability, we try to prevent crimes from occurring or disrupt them in progress, in part by sharing information with people and institutions to allow them to better protect themselves. Reflecting the priority of these issues, last year, the Attorney General's Cyber Digital Task Force analyzed the types of foreign influence operations and laid out a framework to guide our responses. And since the 2016 election, we have taken a number of steps to combat malign foreign influence and support secure elections. First, as an intelligence-driven organization and member of the intelligence community, the FBI pursues tips and leads, including from classified information, to identify, investigate, and disrupt illegal foreign influence activities. And to that end, and as DAD Flores already explained, the FBI established the Foreign Influence Task Force to lead its response, to ensure information flow, resource allocation, and coordination, both within the department and among the department, our federal partners, and the private sector. Second, together with other agencies, through a series of outreach and education efforts, we've been helping public officials, candidates, and social media companies to harden their own networks and platforms against malign foreign influence operations. Third, we have improved enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, one of the statutory tools that helps ensure transparency in the activities of foreign entities and individuals. Effective FARA enforcement makes it more difficult for those entities and individuals to hide their role in activities occurring within the United States. Fourth, our investigations have led to a number of criminal charges and other enforcement actions that have exposed malign influence efforts by foreign states and their proxies. While we work with other nations to obtain custody of foreign defendants wherever possible, just the charges themselves help educate the American public about the threats that we face. Fifth, our investigations have supported the actions of other U.S. government agencies, such as financial sanctions imposed by the Secretary of the Treasury. Finally, even outside the context of criminal charges, we have used the information from our investigations both to warn and to reassure potential victims and the general public alike about malign foreign influence activities. Now, victim notifications, defensive counterintelligence briefings, and public safety announcements are traditional department activities, but they must be conducted with particular sensitivity in the context of foreign influence and elections. And in some circumstances, exposure can be counterproductive or otherwise imprudent. Given countervailing considerations, the department has adopted a public policy for evaluating whether and how to disclose malign foreign influence activities. And among its first principles, partisan political considerations must play no role in our decisions. Our adversaries will undoubtedly change their tactics, and we will need to be nimble in our response. But the framework we have developed to respond will have staying power. And as you can see, the department plays an important role in combating foreign efforts to interfere in our elections. But there are limits to our role and that of the federal government as a whole. Combating malign foreign influence requires a whole-of-society approach that relies on coordinated actions by government agencies at various levels, support from the private sector, and the active engagement of an informed public. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hovland?
Good morning, members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this morning to detail the work of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, better known as the EAC, to fulfill its mission under the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. I also appreciate this opportunity to highlight the great work of state and local election officials around the country. As you know, our nation's elections are run at the state and local levels, with each of the 50 states and U.S. territories running elections in different ways. Election officials in over 8,000 local jurisdictions are ultimately responsible for conducting our elections, and their work truly protects and ensures the most fundamental pillar of our democracy, the vote. Since 2016, there has been an enormous increase in focus on the security of our elections, which is just one of the many responsibilities election officials must address. I'm pleased to report from my vantage point, the elections community has responded in an impressive fashion, considering the challenges we face. Nearly every conference I attend while traveling around the country has a substantial focus on security, and protecting the integrity of elections is a constant topic in meetings with election administrators, our federal partners, and external stakeholders. Even so, we need to ask ourselves a key question. Will that be enough if election officials do not have the sustained resources they need to defend our democracy against potential threats? The good news is that following the Department of Homeland Security's designation of election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, there has been a sea change in information sharing between the federal government and state and local officials. This includes the creation of a government coordinating council, which brings together state and local officials with federal partners, as well as a sector coordinating council, which has helped organize private sector vendors and nonprofit entities that support local election officials. We've also seen the creation of the Election Infrastructure Information and Sharing and Analysis Center, or EIISAC, which now has over 2,100 members, including every state chief election official's office. The deployment of Albert monitors, hardening of systems, increased trainings, and promotion of tabletop exercises around cyber events have all exponentially increased since 2016. The FY 2018 appropriation of $380 million of HAVA funding, which the EAC distributed within months of its allocation, has largely contributed to these improvements. It doesn't cover everything election officials need, but states have had the ability to essentially choose from a menu of reforms, improvements, and priorities that could address their most pressing needs and vulnerabilities. As Chairwoman McCormick testified earlier this year, the EAC projects that 85% of the FY 2018 money will be spent in advance of 2020. We've seen some states use the funding to replace aging or paperless equipment. Other states have replaced their statewide voter registration database or added additional security measures like multi-factor authentication. Some have hosted essential training and tabletop exercises ahead of 2020 to give election officials a hands-on experience that can help them prepare for various threats. One of my personal favorite uses of the FY 2018 funding is the implementation of Cyber Navigator programs. Essentially, the state recognizes that many local jurisdictions do not have the capacity or need for a full-time election cybersecurity expert, so the state employs individuals with regional responsibilities, and they provide technical assistance to several counties or municipalities. This is the kind of innovative program that will help bolster our cybersecurity defenses and improve how states conduct elections. It's also a model that the EAC would like to help amplify nationwide should our funding support such an effort. Unfortunately, not all the news is good. As you know, the threat of foreign adversaries remains real, and ultimately our state and local election officials do not have the resources to thwart a truly determined and sophisticated nation-state actor. That is why we must take action to build resilience here at home and implement policies that deter adversaries abroad, such as a real sanctions regime. Additional funding is crucial to allow states to continue to make necessary improvements that increase the strength and resiliency of our election systems. When we talk about election administration, we are talking about the infrastructure of our democracy. To make meaningful and lasting change requires a consistent investment over time. It cannot just be about 2020 or any one election, but about all of our elections going forward. During a Senate Rules Committee hearing in May, I shared a recent discovery that the EAC's operating budget of $7.95 million is less than the amount Kansas City spends on potholes. It's startling to think that one city with a population of around 500,000 people invests more to protect its residents' car tires and alignment than our country invests in the only federal agency dedicated completely to improving election administration and helping more than 200 million registered voters cast their ballot. I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
We thank the witnesses. We will, with that, I ask unanimous consent that my opening statement be entered into the record without objection. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And let me thank, before I start that, we thank Vice Chair of the committee, Mary Gay Scanlon, for presiding while I was testifying at another committee. In 2016, our elections were attacked. 3 years later, our intelligence community has universally confirmed that foreign actors have redoubled their efforts and are preparing as we speak to attack our 2020 elections. Yet the President has blocked security efforts and cut programs designed to safeguard our elections. His Chief of Staff, for example, apparently issued instructions not to mention election security, quote, in front of the President. The President also has disbanded the Commission on Election Integrity, eliminated the cybersecurity coordinator position on the National Security Council, and dramatically downsized 2 teams fighting foreign election interference. The President's 2020 budget proposed cutting funding for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, our main election security agency, even further. The President is handicapping our agencies from securing our elections. Most disturbing, the latest threat to our elections comes from the President himself. The President asked the foreign leader, President Zelensky of Ukraine, to interfere in our elections. This isn't the first time. In 2016, President Trump, then a candidate, publicly encouraged Russia to illegally hack his adversaries' emails. This past June, President Trump said on national television that if offered information on his adversary in 2020 from a foreign government, he would take it. And just this month, President Trump publicly suggested that, quote, China should start an investigation into the Bidens, close quote. I want to be clear. I believe it is unacceptable to ask foreign adversaries to interfere in any way in America's elections. If we ask other governments to interfere in our elections, if we undermine the public's confidence in the integrity of our voting processes, we are doing our adversaries' work for them. We cannot continue to undermine our own democratic values on the world stage. The President's own officials agree. Ambassador Sondland testified, quote, let me state clearly, inviting a foreign government to undertake investigations for the purpose of influencing an upcoming U.S. election would be wrong, close quote. Each of you sitting here today are responsible for protecting the integrity of and public confidence in our elections. So I'd like to hear from each of you in turn, yes or no. Do you think it is appropriate for the President of the United States to ask a foreign government to investigate his political opponent in the 2020 elections? Mr. Masterson, yes or no?
No.
Ms. Flores?
No, sir.
Ms. Dickey?
I'm not going to comment on the President's activities, but we are committed to confronting violations of
Do
the
you
law
think it is
wherever we found
appropriate
them.
for a president, never mind this president, to ask for a foreign government to investigate opponents in an election?
I'm focused on enforcing the criminal
Okay,
law.
you won't answer. Mr. Hovland?
No.
Thank you. The Mueller report concluded that on approximately June 16th, quote, on approximately June 2016, the GRU, a Russian intelligence organization, compromised the computer network of the Illinois State Board of Elections and, quote, gained access to a database containing information on millions of registered Illinois voters, close quote. The report confirms that the Russian hackers successfully breached the databases, but failed to alter or delete voting records. Last month, I asked our expert witnesses the possible impact on our elections if the Russians had been able to alter the databases. Ms. Plunkett, former director of the National Security Council under Presidents Bush and Clinton, testified that altering those databases would have been, quote, devastating, including because tens of thousands of voters could have been turned away at the polls. Our intelligence community has confirmed that the threat of this happening again is very real. The President, however, has made it harder for federal agencies to do their job and keep our democratic processes safe. Indeed, the White House has intentionally cut your budget and cut your staff. Going into an election our intelligence community has confirmed is under the biggest threat that our nation has seen. The Inspector General reported that DHS's staff shortages are making it difficult for DHS to do its job. So, Mr. Masterson, let's say that in 2020 on Election Day, a county reports that its voter registration poll books seem incorrect, resulting in long lines and many voters being turned away, like what we saw in Durham. What is the specific plan for how DHS will ensure that it is immediately informed about any such issues on Election Day? What is the plan to remedy any such breach that occurs? And do you have sufficient staff to protect against these types of threats?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. That preparation begins long before Election Day, and the work we're doing now with state and local election officials across the country. At its core, our work is to work with the election officials to build resilience. That is, that ability to detect if there is an issue with the voter rolls, and then identify what the issues are and recover. And so that's the purpose of items like our Tabletop the Vote exercise, to work with those state and local election officials about when or if they identify that information, how they'll communicate it both with the local election officials, state election officials in their jurisdiction, with the federal government, and what processes they and we have in place to respond. For instance, DHS has incident response capabilities, both remotely and teams that can come and support election officials in anticipation of possible or in reporting of incidents. In addition, we're working with state and local election officials on preparations. For instance, having in place provisional ballot materials such that if there is an issue with the voter rolls on Election Day, they're prepared to administer provisional ballots broadly and ensure that every voter, while it may be messy, has the ability to cast their vote and know that their vote was counted as cast.
So are you confident now that you have the funding and the ability so that should a county, a large county, let's say, in a key state, is successfully hacked and the voter rolls messed up, that you'll be able to step in instantly and give whatever assistance is necessary so we won't have a long post-election dispute over a couple of 100,000 votes not being properly cast?
I'm confident that the level of funding, starting with the $33 million we got last year and the proposed funding now, allows us to maintain that level of support in order to ensure that election officials have what they need as they head into Election Day. Yes.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've wasted so much time this year in a bogus Russian collusion allegation and on various messaging bills, which are ultimately not going to go anywhere, that it's nice that we actually have the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security and the FBI and the U.S. Election Assistance Commission before us to talk about a real issue, and that's protecting America's elections from foreign influence. There are various pieces of legislation that would, I believe, help better protect our elections in the future. For example, I'm an original co-sponsor of H.R. 3442, which would deny entry into the United States any individual who interferes with our election. Let's hope that maybe this committee could work together in a bipartisan fashion to make sure our elections are once again the gold standard. What the rest of the world looks to is how you do it, how you get it right. We've generally been that gold standard over the years, so we need to get back to that. Ms. Flores, let me begin with you if I could. I'll start by asking a question that relates to H.R. 3442, the legislation that I just mentioned. What's the standard for determining what kind of content posted by foreign agent or agents that rises to the level of being a foreign influence operation? Is there a certain type of verbiage or rhetoric that the FBI looks for? And do you think engaging in such behavior online should bar an individual from entering the United States?
Thank you, sir, for your question. So I'll start by saying that the FBI does not content or police information on the internet. That is certainly not our job and not something that we plan to get into. What we look at is actually known nefarious actors. So if we have identified a foreign actor who is participating in influence operations and as part of those operations seeks to propagate disinformation or post derogatory content, that is of investigative interest to us, but we absolutely do not start with content and work our way back.
Thank you. Mr. Hickey, would you agree with that? And is there anything you'd like to elaborate on there?
No, I think the DID got it exactly right. We focus on known actors and tip the providers in a way that helps them make determinations under their terms of service.
Is there anything that the Department of Justice is doing to work with social media companies in advance of the 2020 elections?
Principally through the FIDF, but we also support the FIDF's efforts and sometimes accompany them in working with the providers.
Okay. Are there any other countries other than Russia that you have seen that, or that you believe is showing some interest in disrupting our elections in 2020 or in the future in general?
We've spoken, and the IC has spoken about foreign influence activities, malign foreign influence activities from China, and we are certainly concerned about others in the course of our FARA enforcement. Obviously, we've seen actions by agents of other nations like Turkey and Ukraine.
And this is to any of the witnesses. What was your agency's role in securing the 2018 congressional midterm elections, and what specific efforts were made in that effort? Mr. Masterson.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Our role, as it is now, in helping to secure the 2018 midterm elections was to provide information sharing, support, and services to state and local election officials to help them manage risk to their systems. So we started by building those trusted relationships with those state election officials that are, I think, appropriately skeptical of a federal role in elections, and by providing value, right? That the information we provide, the services, help them identify and manage the risk to their systems. And so we're doubling down on those efforts for 2020 to reach those local election officials across the state. Cheryl in Jackson County, Ohio, how do we get to her and get her the information sharing she needs to manage risk to her systems?
Thank you very much. And I'm getting close to being out of time, but Ms. Flores, let me ask you this. Would you agree that the FBI's reputation was significantly damaged by political bias against the president, President Trump specifically, that was exhibited by a number of top-level officials in your organization?
Sir, I'm not going to comment on any damage or lack of damage to our reputation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I'll answer it. It really was. People like Peter Strzok and others, I think, very much damaged. And it's unfair to the rest of the organization because the FBI is truly a great organization, one of the best in this nation. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Let me just say for the record that I think Peter Strzok acted in the highest traditions of government workers. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for not only your testimony, but your service to our country. It is recognized and appreciated. Just a note to the gentleman from Ohio, the bill that he's co-sponsored, and there's some variations on that theme about denying visas to those who are interfering in our elections, will be made part of the SHIELD Act through a manager's amendment. And I just wanted him to know that we're taking that good idea and moving it forward. You know, the Mueller report describes evidence that the then Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, shared with a Russian operative, Klimnik, the campaign's, and this is a quote from the report, strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states, unquote, and, quote, internal polling data of the campaign, which is, I've always thought, what was going on there? Why the internal polling data to this Russian agent? Ms. Flores, I wouldn't ask you to comment on that particular item because that's a fact, but generically, why would a campaign's internal polling data and strategy for battleground states be helpful to someone who was seeking to impact our elections? And specifically, what could a hostile actor do to such information with any campaign if they got internal polling data?
Thank you, ma'am, for that question. I'll answer from a strategic perspective. When you look at countries like China, like Russia, they essentially take a whole-of-government approach when it comes to their foreign influence operations. They're not only looking at our federal elected officials, they're looking at state and local elected officials as well, because any one of those individuals can potentially influence policy moving forward. So because they take this whole-of-government approach, any bit of information could help inform their decisions and how they move forward with their operations. So though on the surface it might not seem as a great benefit to them, rest assured that particularly China and Russia will use every tool in their toolbox to get information that they deem potentially as valuable.
You all are the FBI and investigators. We're just, each one of us on both sides of the aisle have been candidates. And one of the things we know is that you could do ads, but you couldn't, if you were interested in polling data, you couldn't do a poll without being caught. And so the only way you'd get this information was from a campaign that had actually legitimately done a poll. A report this month was released by the Senate Intelligence Committee on Russian interference in our elections. And it said that the Russian government used Facebook's geographic targeting features to channel advertisements to intended audiences in specific locations. And about 25% of the ads purchased by IRA were targeted down to the state, city, or in some instances, university level. For example, in Michigan and Wisconsin, they were targeted with advertisements overwhelmingly focused on the subject of police brutality to move populations in one direction or another. Mr. Hickey, if a campaign made its internal information, such as polling data, readily available to a foreign government that then used it to target voters via social media, would that be something the Department of Justice would investigate, or is there no law on that would allow or stimulate an investigation?
So there are two basic categories of laws. One I know, one I'm less an expert in. I don't know whether campaign finance, public corruption, fraud, or other statutes would apply. With respect to the national security statutes I'm familiar with, they tend to focus on whether an American is acting as an agent of a foreign government, meaning under the direction or control of the foreign government. So in the example you've posited, you'd have to analyze whether the American is the reverse of that, whether they are directing and controlling or procuring something from the foreign government, in which case they wouldn't be an agent of the foreign government.
Well, I would just note that we will have an opportunity to in the near future, to make this much clearer by approving the SHIELD Act, which would would prohibit the sharing of internal data, campaign data, by an American campaign with agents of a foreign power, so that you would have a very clear basis to proceed on that. And I hope that we can get a strong bipartisan support for that measure. And with that, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would love to spend this time talking about election security. I think that's really critical. I think that I've prepared to ask those questions, but when we come to these hearings and it's impeachment all the time, that's what this is. This committee was actually, we were told by the chairman, in the impeachment inquiry, but here we sit. Well, if you want to ask the questions or you want to mischaracterize the telephone conversation, you probably ought to go try to get down into the closed hearing downstairs. But you know what? You can't get in, because I've tried to get in. So when I hear the chairman open up with his opening statement about the Ukrainian phone call and suggest that the president asked President Zelensky to interfere in the 2020 election, I've read the transcript. It's out there. It's for everybody to read. You can characterize it any way you want to, but I would suggest that isn't the proper characterization. The telephone call itself mentioned CrowdStrike, Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. And that was what President Trump was asking that President Zelensky look into. Now, when he mentions Biden, I mean, here's my question. We've got FBI here, we've got DOJ there. So here's my question for you. Do you think that a person who has admitted criminal conduct should have immunity from investigation because that individual's a potential political opponent in an upcoming election? What do you think?
So I don't think, I think nations should follow facts and law where they lead in the course of criminal investigations, and do so honestly.
Regardless of whether they're a potential political candidate or not.
Regardless of status or without fear or favor.
Right, so when I also hear, so the other thing that we're subjected to in this committee a lot is if I ask questions and the chairman doesn't like the responses or the statement I make, when I'm done, he will offer his comment on it. That's why he said Peter Strzok was represent the highest ideals or highest standards of the agency. That's really unusual because normally if he wants to make that comment, he's going to ask somebody else to yield some time to him so he can rebut the comment that he disagreed with. But that happens perpetually here because it's convenient. Got a mic, I'm the chairman, I can do whatever I want. But I would suggest to you, that's merely an opinion with regard to Mr. Strzok, because I think Mr. Strzok does exactly the opposite. His misconduct actually reflected poorly and has caused much division and heartache in this country. And that's just the way it is. So we've focused a lot on Russian interference in the in the 2016 elections, the malign foreign influence of the Russians. Are there other nation states that have engaged in 2016 and might engage in 2020 elections?
So, sir, I'll hit on the one big country that we're focused on as we roll into 2020 outside of Russia, and that is certainly China. Make no mistake, China is aggressively pursuing foreign influence operations. They do it in a bit of a different tactic than the Russians. They certainly prefer a face-to-face interaction. They use economic levers. Their end goal is really to seat us as a global economic superpower. So as we roll into 2020, though Russia was certainly a threat in 2016, 2018, will continue to be so in 2020, we are also aggressively looking at China as well.
Did you see other states in 2016 besides China and Russia involved?
I would refer back to the ICA, sir. That was released right after 2016, I believe in 2017.
In fact, in the 2018 midterm elections, DOJ and DHS found that there is no evidence to date that any identified activities of foreign government or foreign agent had a material impact on the integrity or security of election infrastructure or political campaign infrastructure used in the 2018 midterm elections. And that goes to what you said, Ms. Flores, when you said there was no hard evidence that actually any number or vote were actually changed through the system. Mr. Hovland, I've seen your biography. You previously worked on voter registration list maintenance in Missouri. Can you tell me a little bit about the importance of states maintaining lists that are up to date?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, sir. So the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, sets out a process for voter list maintenance, and that ensures that both individuals are able to get registered, but then when someone's no longer in a jurisdiction, it gives them the proper way to clean those rolls. Frankly, having clean rolls allows jurisdictions to save money and ensures that the right people are where they need to be.
My time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the chairman and ranking member for this hearing, and I thank all the witnesses for your service to the nation. Let me ask the question for each of you, please. How confident are you that we will have an impeccable, safe, and secure election in 2020 from the work that you have now done on the federal level? Mr. Matheson, without intrusion from foreign operative. Mr. Matheson.
Thank you for the question, ma'am. Anyone that's run an election can tell you there's no such thing as an impeccable election, right? But the goal is absolutely to build resilience, and I'm confident that the 2018 election was more secure and resilient than 2016, and 2020 will certainly be more secure and resilient thanks to the hard work of the state and local election officials, the private sector that's working with them, and our work with them.
The rest of you, yes or no in one sentence after Ms. Flores? Thank you.
I'm confident that we're throwing every tool we have against the threat to our election security.
Agree.
I would echo Mr. Masterson's sentiment and say that traveling around the country, it is amazing to see the hard work that state and local election officials are doing to address this issue.
But none of you have said, even though I appreciate Mr. Matheson's comment about we cannot have an impeccable election, I think the American people are owed an impeccable election, to be very honest with you. And so I'll follow up my line of questioning about how secure are we, and proceed to raise the question with Mr. Hickey. In light of the fact that there seems to be some loophole in how secure it is going to be, what is the approach of the DOJ in prosecuting, in being proactive for what intrusions may occur in the 2020 election?
We will be very proactive, ma'am. I think one of the most important lessons coming out of 2016 and to the present is how we handle information that a state or a campaign may be targeted and getting what we'll call victim notifications to the right people and following up. And I think we're in a better position now than we were in 2016, both as a matter of policy and our sensitivity to the importance of that.
Do you have a sufficient number of lawyers, DOJ prosecutors, and resources to be ready for the massiveness of the 2020 presidential election and other federal elections?
I think we are well positioned. I think also the budget for 2020 includes additional resources for the sections I supervise that will improve our standing in that regard.
I want to congratulate Congresswoman Loughran for the work of her committee on the question of shielding us from this kind of intrusion, and congratulate her for including my legislation that Mr. Johnson and I introduced in April of this year, H.R. 2353. The language in particular says if a candidate or any individual affiliated with the campaign of a candidate knowingly receives an offer for assistance with the campaign from a source the candidate or individual knows is a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power, the candidate or individual shall refuse the offer for such assistance and notify the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the offer not later than 72 hours after receiving the offer. Ms. Flores, what if this legislation passed, but really its intent, I think, should be acted upon by the FBI? What infrastructure do you have to ensure a quick response to any reporting of this kind of activity?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. The FBI becomes interested in foreign influence activity, again, when it hits those four categories I spoke about in the beginning: the subversive nature of it, the undeclared nature of it, the coercive and criminal nature of it. The FBI will respond as we do in any investigation, with the full might of not only the Foreign Influence Task Force, but the hundreds of agents and analysts out in all of our 56 field offices who are working the foreign influence threat day in and day out. We will use all of the tools we have in our toolbox.
Do you have enough staff? Have you ramped up your staff for the 2020 election? Do you have enough funding for staff to deal with the potential of this reporting?
Ma'am, we can always use more resources, but rest assured we are putting everything we can against this threat and facing it with absolute determination.
Mr. Matheson, I sit on the Homeland Security Committee, so we appreciate the deep dive that you all have taken. So give me an understanding of how you have, as a priority, efficiently sharing actionable intelligence and identifying threats. How have you ramped up that very important part of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd highlight two areas, ma'am. The first is the build out of the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This is the hub of information sharing that we use to reach state and local officials. We have all 50 states and the territories as members of the ISAC, as well as over 2,100 local election officials. So this ensures that actionable, timely information is reaching the field so that they can take the steps they need to manage risk to their systems. The second is our continued push with the intelligence community to provide clearances and classified briefings, whether through secure video teleconferences or in person, as well as working with private sector threat intelligence authorities. So we've worked with private sector companies to provide briefings to state and local election officials about what they're seeing out internationally to help them manage risk to the system. So we're exploring all avenues, trying to find efficient ways to get this information to the election officials.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Ms. Flores. Does anyone at the Foreign Influence Task Force draft FISA affidavits or applications?
No, ma'am.
And looking back at the FBI's activities investigating the 2016 election, it has been reported that FBI never obtained the original servers from the Democratic National Committee that had allegedly been hacked by Russia, instead relying on imaged copies. First of all, is that correct?
Ma'am, I can't speak to that. Sorry.
Can someone else on the panel speak to that?
Yes, ma'am. We got the information that we required for our investigation, and it's pretty common for us to work with a security vendor in connection with an investigation of a computer intrusion.
And so can either one of you answer, does the DNC's cybersecurity consultant CrowdStrike still have possession of the Clinton servers?
I don't know what they have possession of now.
Does anyone on the panel know? Okay. All right, my next question is for Mr. Hickey. And I know that Mr. Shabbat asked you what other countries have shown an interest in disrupting the 2020 election, but what other countries had shown an interest or tried to interfere in the 2016 election?
Based on what I've read, both from what the IC has put out and also investigations by Congress, what I've seen only refers to Russia that I'm aware of.
And then earlier there was a question by Chairman Nadler, and I want to clarify what you think, if you think it's appropriate for a president of the United States to ask a foreign government to investigate previous election interference. And I guess I'd like all of you to answer that question.
Can you repeat the question, ma'am? I'm sorry.
Do you think it's appropriate for the president to ask a foreign government to investigate previous election interference? You know, if there was election interference going on, you know, to ask if, you know, if there's anything he thinks was unlawful going on in other countries, to ask the other country to help to determine if there was something unlawful happening.
I think it's appropriate to understand any attempts at interference in our elections so that we can continue to work to build resilience in the process.
The FBI is interested in any criminal violation as it relates to foreign influence, so long as there is that foreign angle to the foreign influence operations.
Thank you.
I'll give the same answer I gave before, which is I don't opine on appropriateness per se, but I'm focused on enforcing the criminal law.
I think it's important to understand what occurred with our elections so that election officials have the information they need to prepare for future elections.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a question to anybody in the panel that has an answer. In 2016, I understand there were reports that I think were sound that Russia tried to interfere with a lot of state election rolls, maybe all of them. Anybody here aware of those reports? Mr. Masterson, you seem to be first to go to the buzzer.
Probably foolishly, sir. Thank you. Yeah, the DHS, in coordination with the FBI, released an information product out to state and local election officials that stated that based on the information we have, as far as the activity in 2016, that the pattern of behavior, it is likely that the Russian government or the Russian actors conducted at least research on election entities across all 50 states. That doesn't necessarily mean that they attempted to access the systems. It could be as simple as a Google search to understand who runs elections in that state, but based on the information that we and the intelligence community have, that it is assumed that they were at least researching all 50 states' election system.
And why would they have done that?
Presumably, I don't want to speculate, but presumably just to understand how elections are run across the United States
spring training.
and gather information.
Kind of spring training?
Don't know.
Yeah, something like
Yeah.
that. Anybody else have knowledge of that? Have any other thoughts about it? No. How about Florida? Was there not reports that 2 different jurisdictions, voting systems were contacted by the Russians? Mr. Hickey?
So I think we have briefed Florida officials on activity targeting systems and leading to successful intrusions in 2 counties. But I think it's important to be clear, we've also reached the conclusion that there was no material impact on registration or vote counting based on the evidence that we've seen. So I think it is important to be clear about that.
Based on what happened in 2016 and based on what Mr. Mueller told us that the Russians at the time he testified were looking into being involved in our 2020 elections, are you confident that we have given our funds directly to the states, that they will use them to work against Russian and cyber interference and protect those state systems?
I'm happy to talk about that. So at the EAC, we distributed the $380 million from FY18. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, it appears that the vast majority of that will be spent. We're seeing over 90% of that going toward improving security. Again, whether that's replacing outdated equipment, hardening systems, implementing audits. The states have done a number of things, but because of the variations in how elections are administered state to state, there have been different priorities.
Mr. Masterson?
Sir, just briefly on that, we worked with our Government Coordinating Council, which has 24 state and local election officials as a member, to identify priorities for that funding. What we've seen is states have taken that information, which is data-based on our work with the states on where risks lie, and used it to apply. And I'll give you a very specific example. Prior to the 2018 election, the state of Wisconsin deployed 2-factor authentication out to all of its local election officials for the statewide voter registration database, which may seem unremarkable until you realize they have 1,800 local election jurisdictions in the state of Wisconsin and almost 3,200 users of the statewide voter registration database. And so that's a very focused, targeted step, base level that they've taken and used the money.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Masterson. Director Krebs has emphasized the importance of protecting the campaigns based on what happened in 2016 with interference with the DNC, the Clinton campaign, stolen emails, et cetera. He said, shame on us if we're not ready this time around. Have you consulted with the president or anyone involved in his reelection campaign?
Sir, we have made contact with not just the Trump campaign, but campaigns across the presidential election, presidential campaigns, to make sure that they are aware of our services and information sharing responsibility.
So Mr. Mulvaney did not contact you as he did your superior and say, this is a very sensitive subject for the president, don't mention it or dance around it or whatever?
No, sir.
Okay, Ali and free, that's great. I want to thank the FBI, the Justice Department as well. Y'all are stalwarts in the American system of government and the rule of law. And I would have to disagree with some previous statements made that some individuals within your organizations were responsible for hurting your organizations. I think that an individual who's the President of the United States was the one that caused it by questioning those people's actions and down to making statements that were adverse to both the FBI and the Justice Department, which we should uphold. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish this truly were a sincere hearing on election security. If it were, we might be marking up some of the bipartisan legislation that members of the committee have worked on, including House Resolution 3529 by Congresswoman Murphy, Mr. Deutsch, Ms. McChrystal-Powell, myself, to have greater connectivity prior to any intrusion. Or we might be marking up the legislation by Mr. Ratcliffe, Mr. Himes, joined by Mr. Collins and Mr. Khanna, 3238, that would create greater consequence for those who engage in election interference. But that's not what this is about. This is about smearing the President of the United States and validating the corrupt people who have been involved in delegitimizing his historic election. And we know that because just moments ago, the chairman said that Peter Strzok was acting in the highest traditions of government service. Now, Ms. Flores, I believe you currently hold a job that Mr. Strzok once held. Is engaging in an extramarital affair in the FBI with a coworker acting in the highest traditions of government service?
I'm not going to comment on that, sir.
Well, are there any regulations of the FBI against it that you're aware of?
I'm not going to comment on that, sir.
Well, you hold Mr. Strzok's job. Are you saying that you don't know whether or not it's against FBI policy to have an extramarital affair with a coworker?
Sir, I hold a slightly different job than Mr. Strzok held. I'm the DAD over the intelligence branch. He was over our operational branch, not that we are held to a different standard. I'm just not going to comment on whether or not Peter Strzok's behavior was out of context.
Is it in the highest traditions of government service at the FBI to engage in affairs with coworkers? You should know that if you work there.
Sir, I'm not going to comment on that.
Wow. Well, maybe I'll ask you another one. The Inspector General said in his report, "We did not have confidence that Strzok's decision to prioritize the Russia investigation over following up on the mid-year related investigation." So if the Inspector General didn't have confidence in the way that someone prioritized something, would that be acting in the highest traditions of government service?
Sir, I'm not going to comment on that.
The Inspector General further said the OIG found it's not only indicative of a biased state of mind, but even more suspiciously implies a willingness to take action to impact the presidential candidate's electoral process. This is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and the Department of Justice. If anyone is engaging in behavior that is antithetical to the core values of the FBI and Department of Justice, is that person acting in the highest traditions of government service?
Sir, we have an entire inspection division. We have the OIG. There are several measures in place that take into account those questions. I'm not going to answer those questions from the position I am in.
It's just really striking that someone in the senior leadership at the FBI, like an unwillingness to be critical of conduct that was so detrimental to our country. And as people all over America are looking at the corruption that negatively impacted our president and the institution of the presidency, it doesn't really inspire confidence that current officials from the FBI say, hey, you know what? It's a bad idea to be having affairs with your colleagues and to be undermining the trust that people have and to be prioritizing investigations over politics. But nonetheless, here we sit. And in fact, here we do sit. You know, it was more than a month ago, Mr. Chairman, that you announced an impeachment inquiry in this committee. And I believed you that our committee would be engaged in that process. But as we sit here today, 3 other committees are in the basement of the Capitol, conducting secret interviews, engaging in selective leaks. You got Chairman Schiff then coming out and having his theatrical re-performances of transcripts that didn't really occur. And you've got lies about contacts with whistleblowers. Now, regardless of how people feel about the president or this impeachment, one would at least think that if the chairman of the Judiciary Committee announces the launch of an impeachment investigation, that members of the Judiciary Committee might be willing to or able to participate in that investigation. But when I've gone to participate, when Mr. Biggs has gone to participate, when others have gone, we've been locked out. So it is my sincere hope, and I asked this the last time we gathered, that you would take up the cause not just of someone's partisan ambition to impeach the president, but that you would take up the cause of our committee and advocate for our ability to participate, because one can only suspect that the reason that the House Judiciary Committee has been dealt out of the hand on impeachment is because Speaker Pelosi didn't like the outcomes that were going on in this committee when the current chairman was running it. I mean, it wasn't a surprise to the country when you brought in Mr. Lewandowski. House Democrats looked like a dog that caught a car and didn't know what to do with it. When House Democrats brought in Robert Mueller, there were promises that this was going to sway the public. This was going to create a flood of support for impeachment. And that was obviously something that didn't hold to bear. And so please stand up for our committee and let's stop with this busy work. If we want to mark up bills, let's mark up real bills. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our witnesses for being here today. I would hardly call this busy work to protect our elections. So I wish our colleagues on the other side would be as concerned with election security. Back in July, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence released its bipartisan report on Russian interference in our 2016 elections. Senate Intel found that, quote, Russian government-affiliated cyber actors conducted an unprecedented level of activity against state election infrastructure in the run-up to the 2016 U.S. elections, end quote. And they called for sweeping action to protect our 2020 elections. With Election Day just 378 days away, it's crucial that we move quickly. To my questions, all of you are responsible for various aspects of protecting our elections, and you're no doubt aware that a significant concern of securing our elections is that foreign actors will attack election reporting or the results of elections. Take the following hypothetical. Florida reports that candidate X won after counting the votes. The next morning, Florida election officials report that the results were tampered with, and in fact, candidate Y won. What is being done at the federal level to first prevent attacks on our election results, and second, if such an attack occurs, to ensure public confidence in the reporting of our elections? Mr. Masterson, let's start with you and then move to Flores, Hickey, and Hovland, please.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And certainly election night reporting systems, which are the ones you're referencing, are an area that we've worked with state and local election officials to secure, to understand risk to. The first and most important thing to understand that all of the folks on the committee here understand is that election night results are in fact unofficial results, that there is a canvass process that goes on after Election Day. And so ensuring that voters have that information, understand the unofficial nature of results, and that there's an entire reconciliation process that election officials undergo following election night to ensure the correctness. The second is a top priority for us, and that's working with election officials to have auditability of the results and to ensure efficient and effective auditing of those results. That's absolutely critical to ensure not just the loser that they won or lost, but also to reassure the public that their vote was counted as cast. And so that's two areas of high priority for us, working with state and local election officials to empower them to talk to their voters about the steps they're taking, both to protect those systems, but to really offer reassurance and transparency on the back end. And I know election officials take that very seriously.
Anybody want to add anything?
I would just add that in the circumstance where we know or have indications that a state's being targeted, it's really important that we get to state officials at the right level and with a sense of urgency so they can do whatever they can to mitigate on their systems.
Mr. Hovland?
I would echo what Mr. Masterson said and add that at the Election Assistance Commission, part of the work that we've done is host IT trainings for election officials, which is relevant to this topic, work with them on improving audit processes, and certainly think that the issue you raise is one of real concern. There are a number of responsibilities that election officials have, and I believe that the Election Assistance Commission should be more empowered to work on those, but the reality, as I mentioned in my opening statement, is that we're a $7.95 million agency. We have one lawyer. We have one financial person. Since its inception, the Election Assistance Commission has been kicked around like a political football, and we've never been empowered or funded in a way to actually help election officials in the way we can. And I think that right now, in this time, we see the need for the federal clearinghouse that the EAC was created to be, and I would just ask you all to help make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Masterson, as a senior cybersecurity advisor, how have you engaged with local, state, and national media outlets to ensure that unofficial vote reporting is protected from malicious interference? What media networks specifically have you met with, and have any refused to meet with you? And what new measures are you taking in 2020 that weren't applied in 2016 and 2018?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for the question. The first is that the Associated Press, the team that handles the election night results for the AP on election night, is a member of our Sector Coordinating Council, which is the private sector council that we work with on providing support and services, information sharing. So AP has been an active participant in that coordinating council to understand threat and risk, steps that they could take to secure their results reporting, and I know is taking that very seriously. Secondly, is we held a tabletop exercise with members of the national media prior to the 2018 election to talk about what are scenarios that could play out, how is information being exchanged not just with state and local officials, but social media companies, the political parties, and others, in order to ensure that media have access to the information they need before they report on results or other items. Heading into 2020, we anticipate engaging media outlets individually, and then having a tabletop exercise again heading into the 2020 election to work through those scenarios and ensure they have the information they need.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and I too am concerned about foreign interference in our elections and have co-sponsored Ranking Member's Bill, H.R. 3442, which would amend the Immigration Act to provide that aliens who have engaged in improper interference in the U.S. election are inadmissible to and deportable from the U.S., and also co-sponsored 3238, Mr. Ratcliffe's bill, which would prohibit interference with voting systems under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I want to go ahead and ask Ms. Flores, in your testimony, you say that we do know that our adversaries are actively trying to influence public opinion and electoral processes in advance of the 2020 election. You've mentioned in your testimony influencing public opinion through various social media activity. What electoral processes, what efforts to interfere with electoral processes are you aware of at this time?
So, sir, thank you for the question. As we roll into 2020, the one thing I want to highlight is that countries like Russia and China, they pose a pervasive and persistent threat. It's not just based on the electoral cycle. Their foreign influence operations are essentially always present. When it comes to the electoral process, you can look at something as voter suppression. The whole concept of pushing out false information, of highlighting places to vote that are actually not true, this whole concept of disinformation that we've really seen the Russians focus on.
Okay,
That in and of itself can interfere with the electoral process.
Okay, but nothing to the extent of actively trying to hack into or interfere with electoral systems.
To date, sir, we have not seen anything specific regarding hacking into the electoral systems of the 2020 elections.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I have a series of unanimous consent requests that set up my question. The first is a request that it be entered into the record an email from Nellie Orr to Bruce Orr on the 30th of May entitled Reported Trove of Documents on Ukrainian Party of Regions Black Cash Box.
Without objection.
I also seek unanimous consent to enter into the record New York Times article, December 12, 2018, Ukrainian court rules Manafort disclosure caused meddling in U.S. election.
Without objection.
And finally, also from December 12, 2018, from the Kiev Post, update publication of Manafort payments, violated law, interfered in U.S. election, Kiev court rules.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what's happening is that the DNC pays a law firm to hire Fusion GPS, which hires Nellie Orr. Nellie Orr then sends an email to her husband about issues with Manafort and the Ukraine. That then works its way into the U.S. election dynamic, and a court in Kiev ruled that the activities to disclose the Manafort activities in the United States proximate to the 2016 election constituted election interference and was illegal under Ukrainian law. Is there anyone on the panel who has a reason to disagree with the conclusion of the Ukrainian court that that constituted election meddling? Okay, so no one has reacted, any basis to disagree with the Ukrainian court, and the record can reflect that. So my question to Ms. Flores is, what are we doing as a government to prevent future election meddling like that which Ukraine engaged in, where information was disclosed in the United States unlawfully in the foreign jurisdiction and then entered into the bloodstream of our politics?
Thank you, sir, for the question. So I'll harken back to what I said previously. So the FBI certainly is not in a position to police content on the internet. That being said, if the FBI can identify a foreign actor, regardless of country, who is trying to push out disinformation with the end goal of sowing discord, disrupting our electoral process, and it's done in some sort of a subversive or undeclared or criminal manner, that's where it becomes an investigative interest to the FBI. The trick, sir, is identifying that known foreign actor. Again, we can't work back from content. We cannot police content on the internet. So if we find that foreign actor behaving in foreign influence operations, and part of that operation entails disinformation, the FBI will work with the social media providers to provide as much actionable intelligence as we possibly can.
So in this case, it looks like we must know the actor because a court ruled that the disclosure of the information was illegal. And so is there anything that the FBI is doing now to follow up on the decision by a Ukrainian court that there was illegal election meddling in the United States that emanated from the Ukraine?
Sir, I can't address anything related to the possibility or existence or non-existence of an FBI investigation.
But it would seem, I think that my colleague from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, said with so few days between now and the upcoming election, it is just, I know you can't comment maybe on this setting, but I hope sincerely that this Ukrainian election meddling is being identified and being pursued by our government. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding today's hearing. And thanks for the witnesses for being here. We know that Russians interfered in our 2016 election. We know the national security experts have warned that they will do it again in 2020. 2020 primaries are fast approaching, so we're running short on time to ensure that every state is taking the necessary action to harden our election defenses, guard against disinformation, and improve election administration generally. Florida was one of fewer than 20 states that still had elections with electronic machines without a paper trail to verify ballots in 2016. Thankfully, our state's moving in the right direction. Between 2016 and 2018, the number of counties who had paperless elections dropped from 24 to 4, with efforts to move completely to paper-verified systems underway. Now, after learning that some of our systems were hacked in 2016, Floridians expect a strong response to bolster election security, and we expect that whatever is done will improve coordination with state and counties targeted by foreign governments and other bad actors. According to the Mueller report, the Russian military intelligence agency was able to gain access to the network of at least one Florida county government. Subsequently, members of our congressional delegation requested a briefing from law enforcement agencies and were informed that the networks of at least 2 Florida counties have been compromised. Most recently, a report by the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee suggests that as many as 4 Florida counties may have been successfully attacked. Apparently, no tabulation systems were accessed, only registration rolls. But whatever the number of counties impacted, we've got to learn the lessons of 2016 and guard against these vulnerabilities before next year's elections. Florida clearly has work that it needs to do, from hardening election systems to improving auditing procedures, but we can't do it alone. So, Mr. Masterson, certain breaches in 2016 were not immediately detected. What signs should election officials look for? What should they be trained to look for on Election Day to ensure that there are no undetected attacks? And how are you working with state officials to train them to detect such signs?
Yeah, thank you for the question, sir. It starts long before Election Day, so you may be looking for those signs on Election Day, and I'll talk about our activity there. But there are indicators that election officials are aware of and can be attuned to. For instance, in the states that offer early voting, you may begin to see signs of provisional ballots or registration roll activity that's anomalous. The ability to detect that and investigate the registration rolls to see if there's any kind of anomalies there is important. So there are early indicators that can be gained through something like early voting. In addition, in your home state of Florida is a perfect example. The deployment of our Albert intrusion detection sensors across all 50 states' election infrastructure allows for real-time alerting to not just the election official, but to our Elections Information Sharing and Analysis Center regarding possible malicious activity targeting election infrastructure. And I'd note in the state of Florida, Florida was the first state to deploy those Albert sensors across all county governments. And so Florida is uniquely positioned for that kind of intrusion detection and alerting. In addition, having that auditability in place that you mentioned, those auditable records. I think in Florida there was less than 100 ballots cast in 2018 on auditable systems, and a drive towards complete auditability by 2020 is really critically important so that we can detect and recover from those.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masterson. In our hearing on election security last month, the witnesses stressed the importance of treating elections as interconnected systems. We heard that any digital device that touches election processes must be safeguarded. Device security management should be centralized and streamlined. So I'd like to hear from each of the witnesses what your organization is doing to help centralize and streamline the election security process. Mr. Hovland, we'll start with you.
Yes. So, essentially, at the Election Assistance Commission, we are participating in the Government Coordinating Council. We consistently work to put out best practices, but again, sort of our capacity, but beyond our statutory requirements, is very limited. as we have the World Series coming to Washington, I would note that if we were a Major League Baseball player, we would be the 173rd highest paid player. We would be a middle reliever. We have no lack of ambition to take on these challenges and help, but we need the resources to do it.
Appreciate the World Series reference. Mr. Hickey.
Sir, I'm going to answer a bit by analogy. We have a number of department components that touch election security. We've got FBI agents in the field and at headquarters. We've got prosecutors in the field. We've got public corruption prosecutors. We've got national security prosecutors. We've got computer crime prosecutors. All of them potentially touch this issue. And so it's on us to train them so they are aware of each other and coordinated. And that's what we're doing this week. At the end of the week, on the end of the month, the FBI is pulling together an all-hands meeting with agents from around the country to train them, including on how to react and relate to state officials when it comes to victim notification.
Ms. Flores.
Sir, thank you for your question. I would just stress again the creation of the Foreign Influence Task Force, whose purpose was to do just what you asked, sir, to coordinate the efforts across the enterprise as it relates to election security. We've got elections crimes coordinators across all 56 of our field offices whose primary goal is to interact with state and local election officials leading up to the day of the election. We've got our cyber task forces across all 56 of our field offices, and we're working to increase our CI task forces as well. But again, the Foreign Influence Task Force really is that hub that brings all of that effort together, again, leading up to, during, and after the election.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Masterson just quickly answer this question?
Gentleman may answer the question.
Yeah, thank you for the question, sir. Across CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, over a third of our employees in 2018 engaged in election security work across the United States. We have field representatives, protective security advisors, cybersecurity advisors engaging directly with state and local election officials. And then my team, the Election Security Initiative, is the hub of that information. So as we get reporting, as we get requests for services, we're able to quickly and efficiently serve the needs of the community in order to make sure they have the information or services to help to manage risks of their systems.
Thanks for what you all do, Mr. Hovland. I hope we have a chance to talk about what additional resources would mean in this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the witnesses being here today. Ms. Flores, so did you replace Peter Strzok as Deputy Assistant Director of Counterintelligence Division?
Sir, there are 3 deputy assistant directors in the Counterintelligence Division. My particular role is over the intelligence branch. Mr. Strzok was not over the intelligence branch. He was over one of our 2 operational branches within the division.
But he was the one that was briefed by the Intel community IG about Hillary Clinton's private server potentially being hacked. Do you know why you were not included in that briefing?
Yes, sir. I did not enter into this position until the fall of 2018. During the 2016 timeframe, I was in the Counterterrorism Division.
Okay, so you came into your current position after Peter Strzok left?
Yes, sir.
Well, since the Foreign Influence Task Force is a headquarters component, I'm concerned that Peter Strzok ran 2 of the biggest cases in FBI history as headquarters special cases rather than the traditional way of running cases through field offices. Is the Foreign Influence Task Force running election cases from headquarters now?
No, sir.
Then can you tell us the reason they were doing so when Peter Strzok was there?
So I cannot speak to why things were done or not done during Peter Strzok's time. I can just speak to currently what we are doing in the Foreign Influence Task Force, which is essentially program managing the cases across our 56 field offices.
Well, I would think that since there's such a big deal about influence peddling in 2016, even though you came in after that you would be a little bit concerned about the influence peddling when Peter Strzok was there. Are you not? Have you not looked into that at all in your current position?
Sir, my focus is on the 2020 elections and moving forward. The creation of the Foreign Influence Task Force happened in the fall of 2017. We're laser focused on the elections moving forward.
So you don't think there's anything to be learned from looking at what occurred in the 2016 election to help you prepare for what's going on and could go on in the 2020 election? Really, you don't think there's anything to learn from history?
So there are always lessons to be learned from history, and what we've learned in 2016, and I can speak strategically, not just what was happening in the FBI, was really a lack of coordination on the foreign influence threat across the entire U.S. intelligence community. We are now better engaged. We collaborate far more on a daily basis. We're working with our social media companies. All of this, lessons learned from 2016, lessons learned from 2018, and we're going to continue to put best practices forward as we move into 2020.
Well, since you're concerned about 2020, were you aware of President Petro Poroshenko dispatching Olga Vilkova or any other Ukrainian officials to the U.S. to influence our election in 2016?
Sir, I'm not familiar with that.
Are you aware, do you know who Olga Vilkova is?
Sir, I'm not going to confirm or deny the existence or non-existence of FBI investigations or persons of interest to the FBI in this
And that was
setting.
not my question. I didn't ask you that. I asked you, do you know who that is?
Sir, I'm not going to answer that question in this setting. I'm happy to come back in a closed setting and go into detail about current investigations
So
that
you
we have
can't
related
even
to foreign
say
influence.
if you know a person?
No, sir.
Do you realize you're supposed to be telling us about 2020 and you can't even tell us about whether you know anything about people involved in 2016? It really hurts the credibility when you can't do that. Well, let me ask you, will the FITF run informants against political campaigns?
Sir, much in the same vein that the FITF does not run cases, we do not run sources either. We program manage the sources that our 56 field offices run as it relates to foreign intelligence or foreign influence.
Well, I have a real concern about the credibility of what's happening for 2020 if you can't even tell us that you even know people from Ukraine. So I'm very disturbed and concerned.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to say to our panelists today, thank you for being here today, and thank you for service to our country. As you know, trust in our election system is the foundation of our democracy. And when it comes to cyber attacks, time is of the essence. When financial institutions are attacked or our military, the response is within seconds. It's usually coordinated throughout the industry, not institutions, not individually, but the industry, if not worldwide. So given the importance of America's democracy, I presume that we now, and Ms. Flores, you're talking about lack of coordination, I believe you said in 2016 among government agencies as being one of the lessons learned. I presume we have a system in place now to coordinate that kind of information when there's a cyber attack throughout federal government? Yes, no? Question to all of you.
Sir, thank you for the question, and you're absolutely correct. As it relates to cyber incidents, we do have an extremely strategic plan in how we notify our victims. So simply put, and I'll certainly yield to my colleague from DHS to add on here, the FBI and DHS respond to incidents jointly. You can almost look as the FBI lead in essentially the threat response. If a crime has been committed, the FBI will open up an investigation. DHS is the lead for protecting and mitigating whatever vulnerability existed that led to the cyber intrusion in and of itself.
So let me interrupt you. So you open up an investigation, but a cyber attack happens within seconds. So how quickly, who's the lead, or if you don't have a lead, how do you get that information out to all of your investigative agencies, your defense task force, instantaneously? Do you have that system in place? Mr. Masterson.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Following 2016-2017, one of our top priorities was to work with state and local election officials to establish communications protocols for exactly this reason. As you may be aware, in 2016, DHS, being new to the election space, didn't even know who to call in the states if need be. We now have points of contact in all the states. We have information sharing going to all 50 states.
So you do have points of contacts with each and every state?
Yes, and more importantly, they know how to share information with us, because the most likely people to report a cyber
So
incident
you do
are
have
the
a
owners and
specific individual at each stage that you talk to?
Yes.
Is the information, are we talking silos here, or is the information a two-way street, so to speak? Do you have folks at the state level who you trust, who you can work with to make sure you're all sharing the information on a real-time basis?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you for that question. We have points of contact and trusted relationships across all 50 states so that they feel comfortable sharing that information. And then we're able to take and not just respond to that individual incident, but take the technical information in that response and distribute it broadly across the entire election community so they can take defensive actions or look for possible compromises across the entire election infrastructure. And that's the biggest area of improvement since 2016 is the amount of information we're receiving from the state and local election officials on a regular basis, whether it's reporting or those Albert intrusion detection sensors.
So if Secretary of State Alex Padilla from the state of California calls one of you and it's the wrong telephone, do you return his call immediately, or how does that phone call get channeled into the system to get a quick response?
Yeah.
Or is it even a phone call? Do you have a digital system where somebody, puts in types in an alert saying something's going on over here, a certain virus is being detected, so the rest of the country can essentially get on their toes?
Yeah, so first of all, Secretary Padilla has my number and calls me regularly and is an incredibly active, engaged partner with us. You've described it exactly correctly. A report to one is a report to all across the federal government within CISA's Operations Center. We have members of the FBI, we have members of the intelligence community, we have members of our Election Information Sharing and Analysis Center sitting on our operations floor such that as reporting comes in, we're able to take that information, analyze it, support the victim, but then begin the process of sharing information broadly across the sector.
Let me shift very quickly. It was mentioned earlier, the elections are not just about Election Day, but that election period in California, it's about 3 weeks, as well as other states. How do you assure that whatever you begin to detect 3 weeks out is something that you follow up on and is coordinated?
Yeah, again, working through our Information Sharing and Analysis Center, as we get reporting, if there's additional facts, additional jurisdictions, we're able to coordinate that across the whole of government and look for those trends, look for that information that would connect to incidents.
Final question for you. I'm out of time, but I've been to a number of elections. I've detected irregularities. I try to call my local DA. So in 2020, I'm out there walking door to door. I see something weird happening. Who do I call? Or do I Google your telephone number?
So depending on the activity,
we talked about coordination, private, public sector, individuals out there.
Yeah. So from our perspective at CISA, one is you should report any anomalous activity to the local election official, the local election administrator, who can understand the activity you're seeing, remediate it. In addition, we worked with voter protection groups in 2018 and will again in 2020 to have points of contact on Election Day so that if there's reporting that indicates trends, we're able to respond, reach out to the election officials in coordination and understand what's going on.
Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the distinguished Vice Chair of the committee and thank her once again for beginning the hearing in my absence. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Flores, on October 3rd, the FBI, along with DHS, issued an advisory to state election officials that the Russian government would be using voter suppression tactics to interfere in the 2020 elections, and obviously we're extremely concerned about that. Can you give us any idea about when the FBI learned about these Russian tactics and any gap in time between when the threat was identified and when the states were notified?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. I cannot speak in specifics about the reporting. I'm happy to take that back for an after action, but I will say, as we roll into 2020, as we did as we were rolling into 2018, it is our goal, not just the FBI's goal, but across the U.S. intelligence community, to report threat information as quickly as possible to the audience who needs to hear it, taking into account certainly the sensitivity of the sources and methods of how that intelligence was collected.
Okay, you've talked a little bit about the Foreign Influence Task Force that was formed in 2017, and I think you described how it was expanded after the 2018 election, and you described a growing list of foreign adversaries that you're looking at. Can you tell us what resources, can you describe the number of people who make up that task force and whether that's grown from 2017 to the present, and if you need additional people or resources to do that job?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. I'm not going to get into specifics about the actual number of individuals on the task force. What I will say is we certainly surge resources as we rolled into 2018. Our intention is that we, again, are going to surge resources as we roll into 2020. One thing I will note that individuals on the FIDF are not the only individuals in the FBI who are working the foreign influence threat. Just given the nebulous nature of it, it's wedded in so much of what we do in the investigative side of the house, from criminal to cyber to counterterrorism as well. So there are agents and analysts and professional staff across all 56 of our field offices who work foreign influence and investigations tied to foreign influence. Regarding your question about resources, as I stated earlier, we're always happy to have more resources and can use more resources, but the FBI is using everything we can right now to mitigate this very serious threat.
Okay, is the reason you can't give us numbers, relative numbers between 2017 and the present because you don't have them, or is there some security reason?
There's no security reason. It's hard to compare since in 2017 we were focused only on Russia, and with the expansion to include all global actors who are participating in foreign influence operations, it's not necessarily a good one-to-one comparison of where we've come.
Okay. Mr. Hickey, you mentioned that one aspect of the DOJ's efforts to disrupt malign foreign influence operatives is stepped-up enforcement of FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires people who act as agents of foreign principals to register with our government. So I guess we know some of those enforcement acts. It would include the guilty plea by Michael Flynn, who was Trump's first national security advisor, the convictions of the Trump campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and Richard Gates, the possible involvement of Mr. Giuliani and his associates who were arrested last week for possible FARA violations. Are those all the kinds of things you're talking about?
With respect to the last case, I think at the moment those are campaign finance violations, but I think the charges allege a connection to a foreign location, so it's the kind of activity we'd want to be alert to.
Is included there?
So at the moment, the charges are campaign finance allegations. I don't think FARA is pled there. But stepping back from that specific case, if there are indications of a foreign principal covertly trying to influence our politics, whether through campaign finance or political activities under FARA, that's something that we would be involved in.
Okay, I mean, the one I'm really concerned about, which is listed on DOJ's FARA enforcement actions, is the one involving the 13 Russian nationals who worked on behalf of the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election by manipulating social media to advocate for the Trump campaign and against the Clinton campaign, because that included organizing political rallies in states like Pennsylvania, which I represent. They literally took pictures of Pennsylvania coal miners and slapped them on these rally things and tried to stir up sentiment in a particular direction. Does DOJ have the resources it needs to identify and prosecute malign actors such as those I mentioned as we approach the 2020 election?
Well, indeed we do, because we use those resources to bring that case. And fortunately, I think the 2020 budget includes additional funding for the sections I supervise, including the counterintelligence section, which is devoted to foreign influence, countering malign foreign influence, in addition to cyber threats and other counterintelligence activities.
And how about moving proactively before the 2020 election? Because unfortunately, those convictions came 2 years after the influence in 2016.
Yes, as I said in my opening statement, my testimony, preventing a crime or disrupting it is more rewarding and more important than convicting someone after the fact. And we've put a lot of thought into how we will disrupt that and whether we will provide notifications to Congress, to the public, based on various factors, including wanting to make sure that the public is as educated as we can make them.
Thank you, all the witnesses. I see my time has expired.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as my colleague, Ms. Jayapal noted earlier, the Senate Intelligence Committee report on Russian interference in 2016 election states that many disinformation campaigns and cyber threats do not just manipulate just one platform. The information moves across various platforms, or a cyber attack threatens multiple companies. Network security and data integrity. There must be greater cooperation with the tech sector and between the tech sector and the government to address these issues. In fact, we saw today that Facebook removed a network of Russian-backed accounts that posted as locals commenting on political issues in swing states, praising President Trump, and attacking former Vice President Joe Biden. This is a familiar threat that we saw in 2016 and appears to be repeating as we approach 2020. The report we reference recommends formalized mechanisms for collaboration that facilitate content sharing among social media platforms to defend against foreign disinformation, as occurred with violent extremist content. My question is to Mr. Masters and Ms. Flores, and this is simply a yes or no. Have your organizations created a task force to coordinate cooperation between government and the tech sector as they did with violent extreme contests?
So I'll defer to my colleague at the FBI as well, but yes, we're working within my team at the Election Security Initiative. We have a team working on countering foreign influence that works regularly with the social media and tech sector on these issues.
And we'll be ready for 2020?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Okay, Ms. Ferris?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. So within the Foreign Influence Task Force is a significant effort to increase engagement with both the tech sector and the social media companies. Folks from the FIDF meet almost on a monthly basis with those companies. What we've tried to do is create a bi-directional relationship wherein we share with them actionable intelligence and threat indicators. They, in turn, share with us information related to individuals who have violated their terms of service. So it's certainly one of our primary strategies as we roll into 2020.
But do you have a specific task force that helps coordinate all of that, or you're just leaving it up to each group to cooperate with each other?
It's actually within the Foreign Influence Task Force. That's one of our goals, is to coordinate that engagement with social media companies as it relates to foreign influence.
All right. So DHS's May 2019 report detailed the disinformation model, including false information operations, deepfake technology, and digital message creation attacks. Can you please describe the impact of these type of threats to our elections and what DHS is doing to combat them, particularly regarding misinformation about voter registration? Mr. Masterson?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. My team within the Election Security Initiative, starting in 2018, began working with state and local election officials to talk to them about ways to engage voters about disinformation around the elections process. Election officials see this regularly, whether through social media or other activity. It's not new to election administration. And so we wanted to work with them on a variety of products to help them engage the electorate on what to look for, but more importantly, how to empower themselves as voters, to check their voter registration status, to make sure it's up to date, to make sure they understand when and where to vote, what's on their ballot, how the election process works, and most importantly, to understand who the trusted voices in their communities are. There's local election officials and state election officials that have the information they need so that they can head to the polls with confidence. Building on that effort, heading into 2020, our team is focused on expanding that engagement, working with trusted voices across communities, whether that's mayors, governors, or others, in order to engage the American people about how to identify disinformation and how to build resilience so they're not responsive.
I heard your testimony on that, but I know your written testimony, you also said that you wanted to raise public awareness. And with 8,800 jurisdictions, as one of you all testified to that, I forget which one of you. I mean, how are you really getting the word out with 8,800 jurisdictions that have to be on the lookout for this? I mean, you're talking across the country. And when I saw, again, in one of y'all's testimony, I mean, I think you were focused on like a handful of states that you've done some of these tabletop exercises. So what are you really doing to make sure that all 8,800 election jurisdictions know how to detect, report, and work with you on these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So it's twofold. One is by building those relationships with the state election officials, they reach the counties too. So I mentioned in my testimony the Last Mile Initiative. That's an initiative geared towards county election officials, specific to their jurisdictions about how to manage risk and threat, including how to talk to voters about the process and manage voters' expectations. The second is, and you mentioned the tabletops, it's not just the individual tabletops with states. We conduct national level tabletop exercises where thousands of local election officials, in coordination with their state election officials, so their chief state election official, participated over 3 days this year, and then next year we anticipate a high level of participation to talk through exactly what you said. How does information get shared? How do we push it down to the locals? And then how do they get it back up to us so that we have full awareness and can push broadly to the elections community to understand what is the threat or risk and how do they protect the systems?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
General Eddie yields back. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this incredibly important and timely hearing. I also want to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony and also for your service to our country. I must confess I am disappointed by some, not all, but some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who chose to use their time impugning the integrity of former government officials instead of talking today with these distinguished witnesses about the subject matter at hand, which is protecting our republic and ensuring the integrity of our elections. And I realize that each of you in your respective departments work with a wide range of colleagues on precisely that, and I thank you for it. I reviewed the written testimony of each of the witnesses. Ms. Flores, in your testimony, you noted on page 3, and I believe you alluded to this in your verbal testimony, that in the run-up to the 2018 midterm elections, social media companies deactivated more than 1,000 inauthentic social media accounts linked to malign foreign influence actors. The companies made these decisions informed by dialogue and information exchanges with the FBI and other government agencies. And so I take from that that you have a robust relationship with the social media companies, both the FBI, the task force, and obviously other apparatuses of DOJ. I take that to be true. Is that a fair estimate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I very much appreciate the work that the task force and that the FBI and the other entities within our law enforcement community are taking, the steps that they are taking to protect the integrity of our elections. Part of what is the most disturbing for me and gives me the most pause, and I suspect some of my colleagues, is what you mentioned earlier, Ms. Flores, which is that it's happening in real time. Right? Foreign actors, by virtue of the disinformation and misinformation campaigns that they are engaged in, utilizing the ubiquitous social media engines that we all now use in our daily lives, they are changing the way Americans think and Americans interact with each other, the way in which we view public policy issues. And I'm sure you're familiar, there was a report recently, it was covered by CNN, from Graphica, the IRA copy pasta campaign issued on October 21st, 2019. Russian accounts posing as Americans on Instagram targeted both sides of polarizing issues ahead of the 2020 election. Are you familiar with this report?
In title only, sir.
In title only, okay.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hickey, are you familiar with the report?
Same answer.
All right, and so just for the benefit, with unanimous consent, would ask that this report be submitted to the record, Mr. Chair.
Objection.
So I will just quote from this and then we'll get to my question. On October 21st, 2019, Facebook announced the takedown of 50 Instagram accounts posting about U.S. social and political issues in the 2020 election. Facebook concluded that the operation originated from Russia and showed, quote, some links to the internet research agency IRA, the Russian troll farm that previously targeted U.S. audiences and the United States presidential election in 2016. These accounts are attacking Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren. Almost half of the accounts claim to be based in swing states, especially Florida. And what they are doing is not all that dissimilar from what they did before, focusing on divisive content. Much of the content, quote, posted by these accounts was divisive and served to reinforce each target group's hostility toward other groups or individuals. Often, the sets of accounts posted on both sides of divisive issues. For instance, police violence was a topic addressed by accounts in the set, some of them posing with hashtags such as police brutality and Black Lives Matter, and others with, quote, or hashtag Blue Lives Matter and Back in Blue. I know you all are familiar with these I suspect, these kind of postings from before, correct? Ms. Flores?
Yes, sir.
All right, and Mr. Hickey?
Yes, sir.
So the question I have, clearly our law enforcement agencies are working very hard to try to combat this disinformation. But it strikes me that the root cause, or at least one of the root causes of the disinformation, is the reality of anonymous accounts in these social media engines. And there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not universal verification, as opposed to having to constantly be reactive, working with these social media companies like Facebook as a prime example, that instead we could get at the root cause, and it would eliminate so much of this disinformation and misinformation that's being perpetrated at the American public. So I'd like to kind of get your sense, Ms. Flores and Mr. Hickey, as to whether or not that's something that your agencies respectfully have discussed internally, and whether or not it's something you might recommend we take up as a matter of discussion on a policy basis.
So, sir, I will agree with you that the anonymity of the internet generally poses a broad cybersecurity challenge. I don't know, I would say it's the #1 reason why we have so many challenges of security on the internet with respect to foreign influence and others, but it's a leading one. And how you address that, I think, is very tricky. How you have verification or authenticity in a way that you know who's emailing is actually, sending you a message is actually the person they claim to be. At the moment, I'm not in a position to comment on legislation or propose it. What we are trying to do is where we see indications that someone isn't who they claim to be, along the lines of what the DAD Flores said, we'll try to and they tie to individuals that we are investigating, we'll try to tip the providers to it so they can get pierced behind that anonymization. We're also currently prosecuting entities that we allege are tied to the Internet Research Agency in district court right now, which limits my ability to comment on it. But certainly we're hoping to impose consequences for activity related to 2016.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for convening this hearing today. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. Voting, I think all of us would agree, is just basically the foundation of our democracy. And protecting our ability to be able to vote and protecting our voting infrastructure from foreign interference is paramount. In Georgia, where I represent, we've learned that before the 2016 election, a Russian agent visited the websites of Cobb and Fulton counties that I represent, looking for vulnerabilities. While it appears that the agent didn't gain access to our election system in 2016, we continue to face attacks to this very day. Just last month, it was reported that 2 computers were stolen from Fulton County, there again, my district. These computers contain very sensitive information that relates to every single voter in Georgia. And so as we take on these threats, I want to make sure that we're working to build collaboration and transparency across the federal government, the states, and for the American people. And I want to ask each of you about how we can increase this transparency while also improving election security. Mr. Hickey, I'll start with you. I'm curious about your thoughts on whether states should be treated differently than other victims that DOJ prosecutes in terms of sharing victims' identities. For example, it was reported that the election systems in 2 Florida counties were breached, but the government has not identified which Florida counties were breached. On one hand, we want to encourage states to represent and to talk about these vulnerabilities, to report them, and sharing state-specific information publicly could discourage such reporting. But on the other hand, we want the public to have confidence in our election system, and we want them to have confidence in the transparency of our election process. So indeed, you testified, and I'm sorry that I was not here this morning, but I have your testimony. You testified, and I quote, "Exposure of foreign influence operations ultimately may be one of the best ways to counter them," end quote. So can you speak to how you think the federal government should navigate disclosing such victim information in the election security context?
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your nuanced treatment of that issue because it does implicate a number of competing values. We do, as the vice chair of the committee said when she gave her opening statement, we want to encourage and guard the trust of the state so that they are willing to call the FBI and not worry that we are going to release their identities or the problem publicly. 2, I think, core principles. 1, we think it is a matter for state officials to decide when they disclose to their publics what the threats to their particular infrastructure have been. So we will leave it to Florida officials to communicate with the voters in that state or any other state, hey, we've worked with the FBI, we've remediated, we've done X, Y, and Z. We're going to leave it to that sovereign state. But the second key principle, I think, is that it is ultimately state-level officials who are politically accountable for certifying the results of an election. And so the FBI is currently reviewing guidance on how to handle victim notification in the context of elections. And it's not out yet, it's not finalized yet, but I anticipate that we'll continue to notify system owners and operators, which may be local officials, but also providing a heads up to the politically accountable chief state election official or board so that they are aware of what the FBI is doing at a more local level.
And thank you. And Mr. Masterson and Ms. Flores, I'd like to very briefly hear from each of you on your agency's transparency policies and whether more transparency is actually needed.
So I'll speak to that very briefly. So as I mentioned prior in the hearing, we've established communications protocols with the state and local election officials on how information will be reported to empower them to speak to either activity targeting their systems or possible incidents. And then most importantly, being transparent and sharing technical indicators broadly on an unclassified environment to the entire elections community about what threats are targeting election systems so that they can not only take defensive measures, but talk to their voters about the threat being real and the steps that they're taking to secure the process so that voters know that they're taking it seriously and responding. And I think this is where running elections at the state and local level really is critical. Voters have the ability to engage directly with those who run elections and have their questions answered. They can be poll workers. They can watch pre-election testing of the system. In many states, they can watch post-election auditing. So how can we empower those election officials with that information, whether about threat or activity, to talk directly to the voters and respond?
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. Just one thing I can add in addition to my colleagues on the panel. As I mentioned in the opening statement, when it comes to being transparent, one of the prongs of our strategy within FIDF is to share intelligence and information as quickly as possible and to whoever needs to receive that information. Certainly, that is not a decision the FBI can make unilaterally. It involves all members who are dabbling in the election security space, including individuals outside just the 4 members on this panel. But rest assured, it is certainly one of our strategies to be as forward-leaning as we can in sharing actionable intelligence to the people who need to receive it.
Thank you.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to sincerely thank all of you for being here and representing to us the important work you're doing to protect our elections. We take this very, very seriously, and I can see that you do too. So for the viewing public, you know, we have the Department of Homeland Security, we have the FBI, we have the Department of Justice, we have the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. You're so important in the front line, and we are here to partner with you. I'll start this question kind of quickly to direct to Ms. Flores. On October 8th, just this month, 2019, the Senate Intelligence Committee published its second volume of its investigation on Russia's interference in the 2016 elections and the U.S. government's response to that attack. The report concluded that in October of 2017, the Counterintelligence Division at FBI tasked an outside contractor to identify Russian influence activity on Twitter. As the report explains, that suggests, quote, FBI either lacked resources or viewed the work in this vein as not warranting more institutionalized consideration. Ms. Flores, the Senate committee's report is concerning. Do you believe you have enough resources at FBI to investigate and protect our elections?
Thank you, ma'am, for that question. As I've said, we can always use more resources, but that being said, we're throwing everything we have against the foreign influence threat. We've shifted resources to the Counterintelligence Division for that very purpose. We continue to engage with all 56 of our field offices to ensure that they are tracking the threat as closely as we are within the FIDF.
So are you how often are you using outside contractors, or are you moving away from that, particularly in the issue of election security?
Ma'am, I can't speak specifically on the use of outside contractors within our workforce. We do have contractors throughout many parts of the FBI. I can't speak specifically as to how many are working on the foreign influence threat. I can certainly take that back, though.
Okay, yeah, we'd love that information if you could share it with us. Can you tell us whether or not we have ever or would ever use an outside contractor from, say, Russia, Iran, China, North Korea? Do you know?
Ma'am, I would defer that question to our Human Resources Division or our Security Division.
Okay, we'll follow up. I'd like to ask each of you the same thing. Do you have adequate resources at each of your departments, and do you use outside contractors? Maybe we'll start, Mr. Masterson.
Thank you, ma'am. We have the resources we need to build on the success that we had in 2018 and continue to support state and local election officials. Certainly with more resources comes greater capacity and responsiveness, the ability to increase support from the EISAC or build on something like remote penetration testing. But we certainly have what we need to build on the success. And I defer you also to Human Resources and Security on how we vet.
Mr. Hovland.
I would say that the Election Assistance Commission absolutely does not have the resources that we need. I would also echo that the FY18 $380 million that went to the states, well, that was a great first step. It did not provide the states with the funding levels to solve all the challenges that they face. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen people prioritizing from a menu of options, but there are a number of things that state and local election officials could do, and additional funding is crucial to help them do that.
We'd love that information. Thank you for sharing that with us. Mr. Hickey?
Ma'am, briefly, the 2020 budget would increase funding for the counterintelligence section, which I supervise, which would help in our efforts to confront malign foreign influence and nation-state-sponsored hacking. I don't think we employ contractors specifically for this area of work, though, of course, we do have contractors working in the Justice Department, and they are vetted, and I'll defer to others to explain how they're vetted. But I will say, choosing contractors sometimes reflects our judgment. They're folks with particular technical expertise that we can bring on and use them. So in our foreign investment security reviews, we have contractors on board, and we use them because they have particular experience that we as lawyers don't have.
Do you use any foreign contractors from, say, Russia, China, Iran?
What I do know is that we vet contractors, and they have to be screened for a security clearance. So I can't speak to their nationalities, but I know they would be vetted.
Okay. And what's concerning to us, or to me, is that the President's fiscal year 2020 budget proposal would cut funding to CISA. Especially troubling since 2020 is the presidential election year. Each of you, Robert Mueller and many others, have said the threat is persistent, pervasive, sweeping, systematic. And maybe I'll end on this question real quickly. I wanted to follow up, Ms. Flores, that you talked about the disinformation. Could you be specific as to the disinformation that you were able, give us a concrete example of what it looked like? How were we disinformed? How were voters disinformed? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ma'am, are you talking leading into the 2016 election,
yes,
2018
yes.
election? I can't speak in specifics about that right now, but I can certainly take that question back.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to our witnesses. Really appreciate your presence here today and your work. I am still very concerned, and I think the American public should still be very concerned about our elections approaching in 2020. We know that 3 years ago, Russia was wildly successful in attacking our democracy by attacking our elections. And despite the information that we have, and despite the unified voice from our intelligence community, we have a president who is cutting resources to our election security. And it is stunning to me that the President of the United States would be willing to erode our election security instead of fighting to keep it safe. Our voting machines are still outdated. Many of the vulnerabilities still remain today, and so we should all be very concerned, and I hope that you all will continue your work to confront the obstacles ahead of you and to inform the American public. With that said, we know that Special Counsel Mueller's indictment against several Russian entities noted that one of the ways that they interfered with our 2016 elections was by encouraging minority voters not to participate in elections. In fact, the Pew Research Center found that in 2016, African American turnout dropped by 20%, despite the fact that we had record turnout in the country. The report detailed the complex strategies Russia used to target the African American community and to discourage African Americans from voting. Starting with Mr. Masterson, for each one of you, please, What steps specifically are you taking to combat interference efforts to discourage minority groups from voting, and are those steps sufficient?
Thank you for your question, ma'am. Our focus in coordination with the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force is really on building resilience in the American people, talking to them about how they're being targeted with disinformation, where the source of information, the trusted source of information with regard to the election process or otherwise would be. So we've created a variety of products and then are working with various communities and groups, so reaching out to groups like the NAACP, AARP, or others to provide those resources to them, recognizing they're the trusted voice in that community that can talk to their members about how they may be targeted with disinformation and how to respond.
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. I'll just piggyback on that response with this whole concept of media literacy with the American public. We cannot stress enough to every American city to understand when, how, where to vote. Your vote matters, and it's up to you to have that media literacy to understand essentially truth and where you're obtaining your information. On the more proactive side of the house, again, I'll hit on our engagement with social media companies and our willingness to engage with them to share threat indicators as it relates to disinformation when we know that a foreign actor is trying to propagate disinformation using their platforms, and continuing that dialogue and engagement with the social media companies as we roll into 2020.
DAD Flores referred to nefarious actors. Part of what the Justice Department does is help the FBI investigate those actors. So we're often there to obtain legal process of various forms to investigate what foreign actors are doing, and that information can be part of the information that ultimately is shared with the providers to confront the disinformation you're suggesting.
When the disinformation crosses over to talk about the election process or election administration issues like when you vote or how to register or how to participate, that would certainly be where it would fall into our interest area. And in doing that, we're really working with state and locals to encourage their voters or their citizens to participate, to be able to identify trusted sources of information, be able to check their voter registration to make sure it's updated and accurate, and those are, that's where our focus has been.
Ms. Flores, I have two follow-up questions for you. Number one, you mentioned working with social media outlets on preventing the spread of disinformation. We sometimes have American candidates repeating disinformation provided by Russia, for example. Do you alert social media about that kind of disinformation that's coming from American candidates? That's number one. And number two, what specific steps did you take, if any, to identify whether there were foreign efforts similar to those used in 2016 to discourage minority voters, whether they were used again in 2018?
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. I'll address your first question. The FBI cannot be the truth police. It is not our job to police content as to whether or not true or false information is being propagated. Again, we start with the foreign actor. It's that foreign aspect of what we do that is of investigative interest to the FBI. That's the information we then provide to the social media providers, and it's really up to those providers to determine whether or not that content violates their own terms of service. Regarding what steps we saw in 2018, if we saw the same activity that we saw in 2016, certainly not at the same level, and I really tout that to the success of the interagency collaboration, and again, our work with the social media companies.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. In February of 2019, DOJ and DHS issued a joint statement concluding that there was, quote, no evidence to date that any identified activities of a foreign government or agents had a material impact, end quote, on the 2018 election. Now, Mr. Hickey and Mr. Masterson, your agencies reached this conclusion because the intelligence community didn't detect a threat, correct?
I think that's more or less right. The EO, which is what the report was issued under, sets forth a two-step process. The IC, including the FBI, gather reports, and then we evaluate the materiality of any impact.
I understand, but the intelligence community did not detect a threat, and that's why you issued your proclamation that no evidence to date was that any identified activities of a foreign government had a material impact on the election. State and local officials also did not detect the threat. Isn't that correct?
So I think the IC did gather a report of actions that had the intent and purpose of interfering. So when you say threat means to us intent and purpose. State election officials...
They didn't detect a successful threat. I'll put it like that.
That is my understanding.
Okay, all right, thank you. Now, you concluded also that Albert sensors did not detect the threat, correct?
So Albert sensors across the country regularly detect possible malicious activity against election infrastructure, but for
none was detected for 2018.
I'm not aware of any foreign adversary interfering or gaining access to election infrastructure in 2018.
Now, isn't it possible that an attacker could have accessed and changed voter databases without being detected in 2018? Isn't it possible? Yes or no?
So we have no information to suggest that occurred.
All right, fair enough. Now, Mr. Hovland, your testimony was that 8,000 local jurisdictions conduct elections. Many of those local jurisdictions used direct recording electronic voting machine presidential elections, and also in the 2018 presidential elections. In investigating election interference after the 2016 presidential election, how many of the tens of thousands of direct recording electronic voting machines used in that election were subjected to a forensic audit by any federal agency?
I'm not aware of forensic audits that were performed.
What about any other type of testing or analysis on any direct recording electronic voting machines used in the 2018 elections?
I would say that as far as the Election Assistance Commission goes, that...
Are you aware of any federal agencies that have conducted any analysis of direct recording electronic voting machines used in the 2018 or 2016 elections?
Sir, we haven't been asked, and I don't think it's our role to audit election systems. The states certify the accuracy of the votes.
I understand. My question is just simply, has the federal government used its resources to look at or conduct a forensic audit of any voting machines, any direct recording voting machines, either in 2016 or 2018, and it appears that the answer is no. Would anybody disagree with that?
To the best of my knowledge, that's correct. We have not been asked to second-guess the state's certification of accuracy.
Okay, and I'm concerned about the 2020 election, especially considering the insecurity of our voting machines that has come to light in the past 3 years, and I'd like to hear from the representative agencies the response plan should our elections be successfully hacked in 2020. What would be the federal response to a successful hacking in 2020?
The gentleman's time has expired. The witnesses may answer the question.
Thank you, sir. I'll keep it short, but DHS CISA stands prepared to offer a number of incident response services, including deployment of teams to the locality or state, depending on the impacted infrastructure, in order to conduct analysis and work to mitigate the impacts of a possible cyber intrusion on election infrastructure. In addition, we have numerous analysis capabilities remotely that we can provide to help determine if there is, in fact, an intrusion and the best way to mitigate.
So the FBI would work certainly in concert with CISA if there was an intrusion detected. We would use all of our investigative might to ensure that we can determine attribution and potentially bring about criminal charges if need be.
And obviously, we try to prevent it. If we got indications that a state were being targeted, we try to help them batten down the hatches before an intrusion were successful.
And I'd say on a positive note that both with the FY18 $380 million and other resources, the number of paperless machines that are left out there has decreased substantially, and over 90% of Americans will be voting with some type of paper audit trail.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming here this morning to such an important hearing. It's been confirmed, and we've talked about this several times today, that all the main intelligence agencies confirmed that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections in a sweeping and systematic fashion, and it wasn't just a single attempt. We have heard from several witnesses in prior hearings that they are actually engaging in interference currently as we speak. So I want to ask this, and I think the chairman may have asked this previously, but I want to get an answer from each and every one of you. Do you think it's appropriate for a sitting president, or any elected official for that matter, to ask a foreign government to interfere in our elections?
No.
I don't like the word appropriate, ma'am, but I will say that we would urge anyone who has indications of such interference to come to the FBI and work with us so we can investigate criminal violations.
I would echo what my DOJ colleague said. We are certainly interested in any criminal activity as it relates to foreign influence.
No.
Thank you. And during the 2016 hacking, Florida, my home state, was hacked and singled out by the Russian government. They targeted voter registration systems, and they were able to successfully hack into at least the systems of 2 different counties. We actually got a security briefing from the FBI and others on that issue. So one of the things that I asked during that briefing is if they could say with certainty that hackers didn't manipulate the data, and I was told that they actually could not, that you could not say with certainty that these hackers did not manipulate the data. Can you confirm that again with me today, please?
I wasn't at the closed briefing, and I don't know what touches on classified or unclassified information. What I do know is we have said we have no indication to believe that there was any material impact on the ability to vote or the counting or tabulation of votes. And I believe that to be correct.
Specifically about the data, that's why I think that they answered that. But Ms. Flores?
I would just echo what my DOJ colleague said, ma'am. I certainly was not at the closed hearing, but I have no reason to doubt what was briefed to you during that time.
Thank you. And I know that there's a group now in DHS working with federal, state, and local officials to secure our elections. It's called the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council. The council is working to improve security protocols and works with local and state election officials so they can respond to threats quickly. So Mr. Masterson and Mr. Hovland, is Florida part of that council?
Yes, Florida actually has 2 local representatives that are on the Government Coordinating Council and work with us.
Can you just very briefly describe the progress of that group?
Absolutely. The growth and engagement of the Government Coordinating Council since its establishment in 2018 has been great. We have 24 state and local members that represent a vast array of the community. So they represent secretaries of state, state election directors, local election officials from across the country. And the purpose of that group is to inform CISA's approach to helping them secure elections. So what's their view of risk? What services, support, and information sharing would best help them manage that risk? And how do we grow that trusted relationship so that they feel comfortable sharing back with us?
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to a different topic here. Mr. Masterson, on May 1st, 2019, Director Krebs testified that the president still had not received a briefing on Russia interference in the 2020 elections. Yes or no? Are you aware of DHS briefing the president on Russian interference in the 2020 elections?
I'm not aware, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm operational, so that's above my level. I will say we engage regularly in coordination with the NSC across the whole of government on this election security work.
Do you know if your agency has tried to meet with the president on election security?
I don't know, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
Do you think it would be important for the president to understand the threat picture facing the 2020 elections before he allocates resources to agencies on election security?
I think the work we've done across the NSC has provided the information and work that we've done to coordinate that, and so I assume that's part of the NSC's coordination with us.
Okay, thank you. And the same question, Ms. Flores and Mr. Hickey. How many times has your agency met with the president to discuss election security?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. I can't answer that specifically. Again, that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. I just don't know personally.
Same answer, ma'am.
Okay. Do you think it would be important, though, for your agencies to discuss election security with the president?
I think it's important for the president to understand the national security threats facing the country, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Flores?
I think it's important for everyone to understand the national security threats facing the country, especially as it relates to election security.
Thank you so much.
Gentlelady yields back. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our witnesses for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Again, we thank everyone. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.